Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about that, Richard, because in a way, I think if you're talking at the level of almost individualistic journalistic practices, it's quite interesting. I mean, there was a story recently about the MP for Finchley, Mike Freer, being confronted in his surgery by, I think it was some members from, I can't remember what they're called now, Muslim for Crusade, Against Crusaders, the Anjem Chowdhury group that keeps changing its name and being banned. Now, that was reported in a number of outlets, including the Sunday Express, of course, but it was also on the BBC website. But the interesting thing about the construction of that story is that obviously the MP's version of events was given prominence, as was some fairly extreme material from Anjem Chowdhury's website. But there was no attempt that I could determine anyway to have interviewed anybody from the Finchley Mosque where this incident was alleged to have taken place and to find out exactly what happened and what security was in place and how they dealt with it. So it simply became two kind of polarised versions of an event, which of course then fed into that bigger issue of Islam as some kind of menace and some sort of intolerant force. I think Anjem Chowdhury is a very canny figure precisely for the reasons that Richard said, because he's quite happy to play that game. Of course, the result of the game is that the agenda about Muslims and concerns and issues around Muslims for Muslims, things like unemployment and inequality and so on, never make it onto the front page. What's always there instead is Anjem Chowdhury's latest ruse.
I think an issue is as well, I mean, the Daily Express, the Daily Star, they deny. I mean, I recently did a debate with a news editor from the Daily Express. Point blank denied there's any sense of Islamophobia at his paper. The Daily Star, in response to my letter, denied there's any Islamophobia in their paper. And this flies in the face of all the evidence that stands in front of them. I think any rational person can see that there is more than an undercurrent.
I've got some headlines right here from the Daily Express. Christmas is banned, it offends Muslims. Daily Express, 2nd of November 2005. Which Muslims have asked Christmas to be banned? And of course, it's a highly emotive issue, and it feeds into that.
I think unless newspaper, there seems to be this idea that all they have to do is print what they want and then publicly deny. I don't know what you're on about.
Well, the Daily Star, I mean, it's there. In 28th of April 2008, Muslim sickos Mahdi kidnap shock. There's a young girl being kidnapped, and suddenly it's Muslim sicko being associated with that. How can you say that that is not attacking a religion?
I mean, some of these headlines, actually, there was another one by the late and unlamented Sport, which had something like Muslim sickos feed drugs to kids. I remember that one very clearly. So you have all the kind of emotive elements shoved into one headline. You almost don't need a story. You've just got, all of the kind of scary things all together.
It's a failure of regulation as well. Let's not forget this, because...
Well, this is what I was going to come on to in terms of the Liverpool inquiry. What do you think? What do you hope from it? Do you think we can get regulation to deal with this?
It's certainly a big issue for the PCC at the moment, this idea that they won't accept third-party complaints. You can attack a race, a religion, in any way you want, really, and the PCC can't do anything about it, because they say, well, you're not directly affected. And that's a real issue. It should, I believe, it should be that the PCC, they should allow anybody who wants to complain, if they think something's distorted, to complain, to lodge a complaint. That's not happening.
How would you balance that with the freedom of press, though? Because presumably that is the issue as well, because it's such a precious freedom, and any tinkering that could also lead to some kind of
I don't think it's as much at risk as certain sections of the press like to make out.
You think a balancing act can...
I think that Leveson is very aware of the need in society for a free press. I do not buy the argument that if you're not allowed to demonise Islam, therefore we haven't got a free press. And if that's the case, we won't have. I'm happy not to have one. If that's something we've got to lose, the ability to demonise ethnic minorities, I'll be happy to see it go. I just don't believe it's sort of this binary argument between a free press or a government-regulated press. There is huge amounts of grey area in between there, and I think that Leveson needs to be brave. I think he needs to create a new regulated system that will heavily fine newspapers if they breach.
What would that actually look like? A practical example?
Well, I think it needs to have a statutory underpinning. I would like to see an independent regulator, but it has a statutory backstop that exist there, which means that newspapers opt in. They're given lots of incentives to opt into the new system, such as they keep their VAT exemption, things like that. But then they'll be regulated by, say, by the code as it is, with maybe an adjudicator who oversees it and an investigative branch. But if newspapers aren't playing ball and they refuse to pay fines that are levied on them, then there is that statutory underpinning that says, well, you're going to have to face the High Court then, who are going to force you to do what you're told. I don't see, when you have a situation where the Desmond publications don't even bother being regulated anymore, that it can carry on existing. Although, you know, there is a lot of discussion, as we had, about the regulatory system, and I'm still in my own head working out exactly what it might be. I don't know what your view of the...
I think it's a good point. I mean, the first point you make as well about the relationship between freedom of speech and the way you then use it. They're always taken to be absolutes, and Muslims are always accused of being the ones who are stifling freedom of speech at every opportunity. But of course there is that question of then what you do with that freedom, that responsibility. There is the question, of course, about the press and the regulation of the press in relation to the regulation of electronic media, and obviously they operate in quite different ways. So that's quite an interesting one as well. But at the back of it all is the question also of press ownership. If you remember, one of the first things that happened when the hacking scandal broke in a very big way this year was that Murdoch's bid for a majority stake in B-Sky B was, well, I think we could say put on the back burner. It was stopped anyway. And so I think, you know, in a situation where the ownership of the press and media has been consolidated to the extent that it has now, and okay, there are digital channels and other means of getting your message out, but when the mainstream media, the media which everybody uses every day, is in a kind of fairly parlous state and owned by a few people whose interests it then to a certain extent replicates, then I think you've got a problem. So I think legal redress is certainly the main way to go, but I mean beyond that I think there is a problem when only certain voices are getting heard.
And of course everything you've highlighted actually has been a genuine public backlash, and that's why we're even getting the inquiry now. What hope do you think there is that something real and tangible will come out?
Well, I think there is still a battle on, because Leveson, you know, he can make his recommendations, but the government is under no, you know, need to actually implement them. They can say, well, thank you very much, Lord Justice Leveson, that's all very interesting, but Mr. Paul Dacre over here has come up with a suggestion, and we think we're going to go with that. That is still...
Again, looking at how terrified politicians are of the press barons, because of course they get reported by these very same people.
There is a concern that people will lose interest. Public inquiries, by their very nature, tend to drag on a bit. And although there is this public outrage now, we'll see in a year's time whether people are still so interested, especially when you're going to have this real campaigning by newspapers to sort of to set the terms of reference to their own favour, and to keep sort of hammering this free speech is at risk drum. So there's a long war to be waged to try and get the press that I think the British public deserve, and I urge the viewers to keep up and keep watching what's going on.
And how can they actually contribute to, for example, lobbying for regulation whilst arguing for a
Well,
free
I would
press?
say that if people would like to go to the Leveson Inquiry website, Lord Justice Leveson has asked for submissions of anyone, anyone who is concerned about the way that the media is behaving. If there are people watching the show who feel that offended and feel threatened by the media representation of them or people they know.
It's one of the number one concerns that comes up again and again
Well,
when it comes to the
I would
Muslim
urge
community.
them to make their voices heard.
So how would they do that?
They go on the Leveson website, and there's an email address that says ask for submissions, and you can just send an email making your feelings known. If people don't speak up, then change won't come. So I urge people just to take 10 minutes out of their day and make their voice heard, and I think it would do a lot of good.
Well, on that note, on a practical note, as well as our discussion that we've had, I'd also like to just end with a quote from the Daily Star, which says, "The Daily Star editorial policy does not hold any negativity towards Islam, and the paper has never and does not endorse the EDL." Well, we'll let you make up your minds, our viewers, and do join us same time next week. Don't forget, you can also tweet us, and you can watch us again on YouTube. Thank you to both our guests. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Peter, for giving us your time.